Going now to Rushanara, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that were raised earlier on before I go into tax administration digitisation. And just picking up on Siobhan's question for Bill Dodwell, you talked about the self-employed, for instance, cabbies, and in relation to, excuse me, in relation to Uber, for instance. But there's a big difference, isn't there, between a company like Uber worth 50 to 70 billion pounds worth, and the local cabbie down the road in constituency. And are there ways in which we can address some of these inequities in the way that big companies, in effect, play the system in a way, and are not actually true to what they're really doing, true to the essence of what they're about? Is there more we can do around that? Because you were quite determined in your point about the cabbies being self-employed, but Uber is not any ordinary cabbie.
Firstly, it's not right for me to comment specifically on one particular player in the market. But if you read our reporting and paying tax reports dated October 2019, released on Halloween, you'll be pleased to know, we essentially said that there was a real case for information provision and even possibly considering withholding, where you have a market where there are a whole range of engagers, and typically the individuals providing the services do so through the means of an engager. So for me, it's exactly the same dealing with a global company and a platform to a very large private hire firm primarily based in the UK to Ealing taxi cabs, because when I want a taxi, surely I phone up a taxi firm. I don't phone up a particular driver. And so for me, you should look at that sort of market situation where you have the situation there are intermediaries, third parties there. And another case, for example, is holiday properties, where again, almost all that market is dominated by a whole range of intermediaries, not just one, whom we can all think, but there are plenty of others there too. You should ask those intermediaries to provide information to HMRC, and we think overall that will be a help to taxpayers generally. That was the basis of our work and that report there.
But there's definitely some work there's work that needs to be done around what, in the age of technology and innovation, of course, nobody's denying that these companies have provided an innovative solution, and it's not all bad, but there are areas that create a lot of concern, particularly around rights and so on. The intermediaries I suppose I'm adding to the complexity in raising the question about what we do in relation to intermediaries. Did others want to come in on this? Professor Friedman, did you want to come in?
Well, I think what Bill is suggesting is precisely what I was talking about, that we have a particular problem with platforms. We tackle that problem with a set of definitions that works for that area. And we deal with it both from a rights point of view and from a tax point of view by looking at that particular set of problems.
Okay, thank you.
But I think it's important you don't distort a market by, putting up a huge barrier for one of the players in the market, such that you end up with a migration to other players in the market generally. So that for me would be a really important consequence to consider in designing a system for the future.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. So just moving on to the digitisation agenda. You've talked about the benefits. Can you point to any issues that are coming up, particularly for those who are self-employed, about where the downsides might be and how government could address those ahead of the implementation that comes into place by 2023?
Yeah, sure. The first thing to say is that the government has mandated making tax digital for VAT, and that essentially requires that a business that is required to be VAT registered must maintain digital records and must submit those digitally rather than typing them in to the HMRC portal to submit their VAT return. And that's a system that by and large has gone pretty well. There are about 400 different software providers, mainly because there are lots of different industries and specialties and that sort of thing. And that's why there are so many different software packages out there. But over 400 have adapted to be able to provide the VAT information into HMRC. The challenge when you move on to income tax is firstly you're moving smaller in that you're going to a population that isn't VAT registered, so you're imposing requirements for the first time on them. And it would be as well, we would suggest to start proving a system at the top end with people who are already using digital systems, and then moving on to a scenario of people who are introducing for the first time those digital accounting systems. So start larger, if you like. But you also would need a system of essentially combining information. So if you have, for example, a self-employed person who owns a buy-to-let property and has got some dividends or interest income, you need something that's going to take all those different sources, because the business accounting package the person will use for their self-employed business may not be the same as does buy-to-let accounting, and certainly won't necessarily pick up interest or dividends or anything else. So you need something in that sort of area, and inviting the market to deal with all of that is definitely worthwhile. There's also possibly the case for looking at a cash incentive. Back in the time of Lord Carter, who was one of the sort of pioneers who looked very extensively at digitizing tax, he recommended and was introduced incentives for businesses to submit data digitally in the form of real money off. And what it did was it gave a bit of an incentive anyway. It was sent a really good signal. It wasn't a massively expensive thing, but it was a contribution to the substantial costs businesses take when they have to buy a new accounting package and all of that. Now, most of this, again, is focused on really micro businesses, single individuals, small number of people working together. For me, it's also important that HMRC thinks harder about larger businesses for whom this is probably a completely unnecessary form of information gathering. Large businesses already provide very substantial information to HMRC and probably don't need to add to it.
Just one more for you. How realistic is it, the digitization plans, given that given delays have occurred in the past?
Well, I think, what we've got at the moment is a sort of 3 years' time announcement, which ought to be sufficient time to allow the market to develop. But as I say, if we started with only part of the market, for us, that would be a good thing, because it would help prove the robustness of the systems before sort of extending them down to those for whom a much bigger change might be anticipated.
So you do, despite the current crisis and the upheaval, you don't see a major issue in terms of meeting the target, provided that the approach that you're suggesting is taken.
I think so. I mean, it's a bit hard to know whether HMRC will be able to adapt its systems in time, given all the other burdens it has of, trying to work from home, Brexit and the new information systems needed for that and everything else. And, we've emphasized it's really important that the single digital account, that interaction between the taxpayer and the tax authority is part of this, so that there's a sort of benefit all round, rather than data arriving in a sort of unstructured manner and not necessarily being very useful to HMRC.
Okay, thank you. Derek, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I guess just a couple of points there. And I've talked previously about the extra burden that comes with being self-employed. And I'm keen that as we go into sort of digital taxation and that being rolled out to the self-employed over, I guess, the next 3 years, that is kept in mind. So there was a conversation earlier about perhaps collecting data on a monthly basis, and certainly I'd be saying, let's not try and make that mandatory. If you want to have the facility, then yeah, make the facility available, but don't compel people to report that often. They are trying to earn a living, and it's important to remember that a lot of the average self-employed salary is lower, or earnings is lower than the average employee earnings. So in many cases, these are not high earning, sophisticated people, and we're asking them to go digital. Well, let's try and keep it as simple as possible for them. Quarterly rather than monthly submissions of data, but also again, this will be yet another sort of financial burden in many cases, because they will now have to move off paper records or Excel spreadsheets into sort of integrated digital technology, and there's going to be another cost associated with it. So again, these are all additional burdens that you see on the self-employed that you wouldn't see on somebody in a similar role, perhaps who was in full-time employment.
And some would argue that they've been shafted during this crisis, particularly those who've been identified as being excluded without any support from the government, as you rightly pointed out earlier. Can I just bring in Andrew and others on one final question, which is, does digitisation help tackle tax avoidance? Will it by a substantial amount? Andrew?
I mean, I think that is impossible to say, in the sense of sort of, it's going to, I think what's really important is that clearly digitisation, in many respects, the aim is absolutely laudable, in the sense of giving HMRC more up-to-date information, on a more regular basis, and that's got to help the administration of tax, you would think, if it's done well. And I think the really important thing is that it's phased. The phasing of the process and the consultation of the process is done with a view to the fact that there are going to be a lot of hurdles to get over for many businesses to implement this properly. And the only way it's going to work effectively for HMRC is if businesses have time to implement it properly and adjust to the new way of working. I think the other thing is that, if we're talking about tax and we're talking about the right amount of tax, there is some discussion in some of the documents that have come out with making tax digital of whatever stripe, that this is, it's going to be a simplification that will make everything easier to get right. But actually, it depends on how you do it again, because if you digitize the existing tax system, then you're going to digitize all of the complexity that exists within it. So actually, if you want tax to be easier and easier to get right and all of that, then actually digitization is one step, but actually looking at the tax system again and the complexities in there is also very important, if not more important than digitizing it, I would say.
Okay. Professor Friedman, did you want to come in on the point about tax avoidance, whether digitization will help?
Well, I was going to agree with Andrew, actually, that when you're looking at digitization, you've got to look at the underlying system. So you're not going to deal with avoidance without dealing with the underlying system and the complexities in the system which give rise to avoidance, particularly having lots of boundaries, which is what mostly gives rise to avoidance. So I think the two have to go hand in hand. But I also think, going back to your point about the people who've been excluded from support, had we had more information in a better form available to the Treasury, then it might have been possible, or to HMRC, it might have been possible to exclude fewer people. And one of the barriers to providing them with support was not having sufficient information in the right form. So in the end, there should be a way of getting more information for the benefit of taxpayers, as well as reducing avoidance.
Great, thank you. I think my time's up.
Right, thank you.